All right, let's dive into something a bit unnerving. China's nuclear ambitions. We've got some really interesting reports here about how their nuclear arsenal is growing, and we've got analysis from both U.S. and Chinese perspectives. So,
Yeah, it's really striking how fast China's strategy is changing. It's not just about a few more warheads. U.S. intelligence is saying they could increase their arsenal fourfold by 2030. To put that in perspective, they've had a minimal deterrence policy for decades, which means a pretty small arsenal compared to the U.S. and Russia.
so what changed? Something happened around 2020, right? That shifted China's thinking.
Yeah, it seems like there was a turning point around then.
Hmm.
Our sources point to the construction of 3 new silo fields in China. Each one could house hundreds of ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, the heavy hitters of a nuclear arsenal, designed to deliver warheads across huge distances.
That does sound like a major escalation. But what does minimal deterrence actually mean in practice? And why is China moving away from it now?
Well, minimal deterrence basically means having enough nukes to guarantee a devastating retaliatory strike if you're attacked. It's defensive. It relies on the threat of unacceptable consequences to deter any potential aggressor. Think of it as a life insurance policy for a nation. It only needs to be used once, but it needs to be completely reliable. As for why they're moving away from it, well, Chinese sources say the global security environment is way more volatile and uncertain now, especially with what they see as growing U.S. military power in the Asia-Pacific.
So China's feeling the pressure, and they're beefing up their nuclear arsenal in response. But it's not just about quantity, is it? Our sources also mention some pretty advanced tech China's developing, like hypersonic glide vehicles. This isn't your grandfather's nuclear program anymore.
No, it's not. These hypersonic vehicles are designed to travel at incredible speeds. They could even orbit the Earth before hitting their targets. Makes them super hard to track and intercept. A real challenge for current missile defense systems. One source even called them fractional orbital bombardment systems.
Sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. And I bet this has caught the attention of U.S. defense analysts. How are they interpreting this rapid development?
The U.S. view seems to be one of serious concerns. Some analysts see this as a strategic breakout, meaning China is going beyond just a defensive nuclear posture and developing capabilities that could be used offensively.
Offensively, does that mean a first strike capability, the ability to wipe out an adversary's nuclear forces in a preemptive attack?
Well, some U.S. officials say that China's silo construction, combined with these advanced technologies, could mean they're moving towards a first strike strategy. But it's important to say that a lot of experts disagree with that. They say we shouldn't read too much into capabilities alone. Intentions matter too, and those are much harder to figure out.
So it's not necessarily a clear-cut case of China going rogue. What do Chinese analysts have to say about this? Are they aiming for global dominance, or is there a different logic at play?
Chinese analysts and experts push back hard on the idea that their country wants nuclear supremacy or a first strike capability. They say their buildup is just a response to what they see as a growing threat from the U.S., especially its nuclear modernization programs and its increasingly assertive military presence in the Asia-Pacific.
So kind of a nuclear chicken and egg situation.
Exactly. And if we look closer at the Chinese sources, we can see some specific U.S. policies and actions that have fueled these anxieties in Beijing.
Okay. Let's unpack those concerns. What are the specific U.S. actions that China sees as particularly threatening?
Well, one big one is the 2018 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review. It lowered the threshold for using nuclear weapons. This review signaled a potential shift in U.S. policy. It suggested that nuclear weapons could be used not only in response to a nuclear attack, but also in response to some non-nuclear attacks, particularly those targeting critical infrastructure or weapons of mass destruction.
That does seem like a big change. I can see why China would be worried, especially since they have a no first use policy.
Right. That no first use policy means China promises not to be the first to use nuclear weapons in a conflict. So this shift in U.S. policy obviously worried Beijing because it expands the scenarios where the U.S. might think about using nukes.
So from China's perspective, the U.S. is becoming more willing to rattle its nuclear saber. Are there other U.S. actions fueling these anxieties? What about new weapon systems?
Yeah, another major concern is the U.S. developing advanced conventional weapons that can target China's nuclear forces. This is called conventional counterforce.
So the U.S. is developing weapons that could take out China's nuclear arsenal without actually using nukes. I can see how that would make China feel vulnerable.
Absolutely. And it directly undermines the credibility of China's assured retaliation capability, which is the bedrock of their nuclear deterrence strategy. If China thinks they can't retaliate after a nuclear strike, They might feel like they have to take preemptive action or escalate their own nuclear buildup to compensate.
It's a dangerous dynamic. And it's not just conventional weapons, right? We also have the U.S. missile defense system to consider.
That's another key piece of this puzzle. The U.S. says its missile defense systems are mainly aimed at defending against rogue states, like North Korea or Iran. But China's suspicious. They see these systems as a potential threat to their own assured retaliation capability.
So even if China survived a first strike, their retaliatory strike might be intercepted by U.S. missile defenses?
Right. It would basically make their deterrent useless. And on top of all that, we have the collapse of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, INF Treaty, in 2019. This treaty, signed by the U.S. and the Soviet Union in 1987, banned all land-based missiles with ranges between 500 to 500 kilometers.
So now the U.S. is free to develop and deploy intermediate-range missiles that could target China. That must be a huge concern for Beijing.
Absolutely. All of this together has created this perception in China that the U.S. is actively trying to undermine their nuclear deterrent and gain a strategic advantage in the region.
Okay, so China's facing a number of perceived threats from the U.S., and that's driving their nuclear buildup. But what are China's strategic goals here? Are they just trying to match the U.S., or do they have something else in mind?
That's the key question. To understand China's perspective, we have to dig into their strategic thinking and examine the nuances of their nuclear doctrine.
We were talking about China's strategic thinking, so help us understand their goals with this nuclear buildup. Are they just trying to keep up with the U.S., or is there something more going on?
Well, Chinese sources always emphasize assured retaliation as their main goal, meaning they want to be sure they can respond with devastating force if they're attacked with nuclear weapons. This points to a defensive posture, focused on deterring an attack rather than starting one.
But if deterrence is the goal, why such a huge increase in warheads? Wouldn't a smaller arsenal be enough to guarantee a retaliatory strike?
It's more complicated than that. Some Chinese experts say a larger and more diverse nuclear force is necessary to maintain a credible deterrent with all these evolving threats, especially those they see coming from the U.S.
So what makes this situation different? Different from, say, the Cold War, when China had a much smaller arsenal?
The Chinese sources point out a few key differences. First, they talk about advancements in U.S. missile defense technology. They argue that they need a bigger arsenal to make sure enough warheads get through, enough to guarantee a devastating retaliatory strike, even if some are intercepted.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about getting past those defenses and making sure their deterrent remains credible. What else worries them?
Another thing they bring up is the U.S. developing conventional counterforce capabilities. They worry that the U.S. might be tempted to launch a preemptive strike against China's nuclear forces, using conventional weapons, thinking they could cripple China's ability to retaliate.
But wouldn't that be incredibly risky? Attacking China's nuclear forces, even with conventional weapons, it could really escalate things, couldn't it?
Exactly. And that's what Chinese strategists are saying. They argue that the U.S. developing these conventional counterforce capabilities makes miscalculation more likely. And it could pressure China into adopting a more aggressive nuclear posture, like a launch-on-warning strategy.
That sounds pretty scary. What exactly does launch-on-warning mean, and why would China even consider it?
Launch-on-warning means launching your nukes as soon as you detect an incoming attack, before enemy missiles actually hit your territory. It's a high-risk strategy, but it's designed to minimize the chances of your own forces being destroyed on the ground.
So instead of absorbing a first strike and then retaliating, you launch your missiles while they're still in the air. I can see why that would be tempting if you felt like your nuclear forces were vulnerable to a surprise attack.
Right, and here's where it gets really tricky. The more the U.S. invests in conventional counterforce and missile defense, the more China might feel they have to adopt strategies like launch-on-warning, just to guarantee their ability to retaliate. But a launch-on-warning posture, by its very nature, increases the risk of miscalculation and accidental launches, which could lead to a catastrophic escalation.
It's a vicious cycle. One side tries to make itself more secure, and it ends up making the other side feel less secure, leading to this dangerous spiral of escalation. So what can we do to break this cycle? How can we de-escalate the situation?
That's the big question. Policymakers and experts on both sides are wrestling with it. There's no easy answer. But our sources do suggest a few possible ways forward.
All right, let's hear them. What steps could reduce tensions and prevent things from getting out of control?
One thing that comes up again and again in our sources is greater transparency and communication. China could be more open about its nuclear posture. Explain its intentions and actions in a way that eases U.S. concerns.
But China's always been very secretive about its military. Do you really think they'd be willing to open up? especially about something as sensitive as their nuclear program.
It's definitely a challenge. But there are signs that China recognizes the need for more transparency to build trust and avoid misunderstandings. Some Chinese experts suggest, for instance, that China could be more upfront about its nuclear doctrine and its decision-making processes. They could also think about inviting international observers to witness some military exercises or inspections of their nuclear facilities.
So more communication, more openness, showing their cards a bit, so to speak. What about the U.S.? What can Washington do to de-escalate things?
The U.S. has a role to play, too. One important step would be to rethink policies that China sees as threatening, like developing conventional counterforce capabilities. Some experts argue that going down this path just makes China feel more insecure and pushes them to expand and diversify their nuclear arsenal even more.
So it's not just about telling China to calm down, it's about the U.S. looking at its own policies and seeing how they might be adding to the problem.
Exactly. The U.S. could also consider confidence-building measures, things like giving advance notice of missile tests or inviting China to observe military exercises. These steps wouldn't compromise U.S. security, but they could show good faith and reduce the risk of misinterpretation or accidental escalation.
So both sides need transparency and confidence-building measures. But what about arms control? Are there any treaties or agreements that could help limit this arms race?
Unfortunately, the global political climate isn't great for arms control agreements right now. The collapse of the INF Treaty is a perfect example. And with this growing rivalry between the U.S. and China, it's hard to imagine them sitting down and working out a new treaty anytime soon. However, some experts say that even without formal treaties, there's still room for dialogue and informal agreements on certain issues.
What would those informal agreements look like?
One possibility would be setting clear, red lines about developing and deploying certain types of weapons, especially those that are really destabilizing, or increase the risk of things accidentally escalating. Another area for agreement could be limits on the size and scope of military exercises in sensitive regions.
So even without a formal treaty, there are ways to manage the competition and set some boundaries. But let's face it, there are powerful forces on both sides pushing for a more confrontational approach. How do we overcome that and create a more stable environment?
That's the real challenge. Changing how people think and overcoming those deep-rooted bureaucratic interests is never easy. But our sources do point to a few things that might help. One is public opinion. If people in both countries understand the risks of a nuclear arms race and the benefits of working together, they can put pressure on their leaders to adopt more responsible policies.
So it's not just about governments talking to each other, it's about a broader dialogue, including experts, academics, and even ordinary citizens. We need to move past those simplistic narratives of good guys versus bad guys, hawks versus doves.
Exactly. The reality is much more nuanced and complex. To find solutions, we need to understand everyone's perspectives, motivations, and fears.
So it sounds like we need a real change in thinking here. We can't just see security as a zero-sum game, where one side wins and the other automatically loses.
Exactly. And this is where the idea of a nuclear shield comes in. This is where it gets really fascinating.
A nuclear shield, what does that even mean?
Well, it's a complex idea with different interpretations. But basically it means a country could use its nuclear arsenal to create this protective umbrella so they could pursue conventional military operations without worrying about nuclear retaliation.
So they're basically saying, our nuclear deterrent is so strong, no one would dare attack us, even if we do aggressive things conventionally.
Yeah, that's the general idea. Now, looking at the current situation, some Chinese analysts say that as the U.S. develops better conventional weapons and missile defenses, China might feel like it needs to strengthen its own nuclear capabilities to create a stronger nuclear shield.
So they're not necessarily trying to be aggressive or dominate the world. They just want to feel secure enough to act more assertively in their own region, without worrying about a nuclear response from the U.S.
That's one way to look at it.
Yeah.
But this nuclear shield concept is really controversial. Critics say it's inherently destabilizing and could lead to miscalculations and escalation.
I see how that could be a problem. If a country thinks it has a nuclear shield, they might be more likely to take risks and do things that could provoke a conflict.
Exactly. That's why it's so crucial to understand these different points of view and the potential consequences of what countries might do. We're dealing with incredibly complex and sensitive issues here, with really high stakes.
It definitely highlights the need for clear communication, transparency, and a willingness to see things from the other side's perspective. But realistically, how do we move from this situation with growing mistrust and military buildup to a more stable and cooperative relationship?
It's not going to be easy, But our sources do offer a few ideas. One is to focus on areas where both sides have a shared interest and can cooperate, where both sides benefit.
Like what? It's hard to imagine the US and China suddenly being friends.
True, but their interests do align in some areas, like fighting climate change, preventing pandemics, and keeping the global economy stable. Cooperating on these things could help build trust and create a base for tackling tougher issues.
So start with the easier stuff, build some momentum, and hopefully that opens the door for the bigger challenges. What else?
Another important step is to encourage people-to-people exchanges, educational programs, and cultural collaborations.
Right, the idea being, the more we understand each other, the less likely we are to see each other as enemies. But how do you do that when there's so much geopolitical rivalry?
It takes effort and a willingness to look past the current political problems. Encourage things like student exchanges, joint research projects, artistic collaborations, anything that lets citizens from both countries interact, learn from each other, and build relationships.
Yeah, those kinds of things can help break down stereotypes and build bridges between people. So we've got cooperation on shared challenges and building connections between people. Anything else?
Finally, and this might be the most important, both sides need to be more restrained in their military deployments and their rhetoric. Cut back on the provocative military exercises. Tone down the aggressive language. And focus on de-escalation and confidence-building measures.
It's about taking real action to reduce tensions and showing a real commitment to stability instead of constantly trying to outdo each other. Sounds like a tall order, but this deep dive has made it clear that the stakes are incredibly high.
They really are. And there aren't any simple answers. But we can't just give up and accept a future of escalating tensions and the constant threat of nuclear war.
Well, this has been a fascinating and honestly, a pretty sobering look at nuclear strategy and great power competition. We've covered a lot. From China's changing nuclear posture to how the U.S. is responding and the different things driving this complex relationship. We talked about the dangers of escalation, the potential for miscalculation, and the urgent need for dialogue, transparency, and a more cooperative approach.
The main takeaway is that this isn't just about abstract geopolitical ideas. We're talking about decisions and actions that have huge consequences for billions of people. It's a reminder that we all have a part to play in this.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with one final thought. We've explored the expert analysis, different perspectives, and potential ways forward. Now we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this? What steps do you think would be most effective in preventing an arms race and ensuring a more stable and peaceful future?
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep digging deeper. The more we understand these challenges, the better we'll be able to deal with them and create a safer world for ourselves and future generations.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.